Hello everybody, welcome to another online message from Acts Community Church here in Rhondda. My name is Rob Jones and it's my privilege to be able to bring a message to you today. I want to bring a short message which I've entitled, God Gives Grace to the Humble. And I want to say this, being a disciple and a follower of Jesus and living in God's kingdom means radical life change. When we come to that point in our lives where we believe in Jesus, real change begins to happen in our lives. God's Spirit does a deep and a transformational work in our lives and creates a new DNA within us so that we begin to develop and to express the same characteristics and attitudes that we see in Jesus. Now, this obviously is a lifetime process. And sometimes we will feel like we've hardly begun when we hear ourselves say certain things, when we catch ourselves thinking certain things, or when we realize that our actions fall so far short of what should be expected of anyone who claims to be a disciple or a follower of Jesus. But today I want to focus on just one of the standout characteristics that we see in Jesus, and that is humility. When we look around our world today, and we look at the people who have leadership responsibility in our world today, humility is not the first word we'd use to describe the attitudes that they so often display. But throughout the Bible, one of the most valued characteristics in a person is humility. And what is that humility? Well, it's that disposition within the human spirit that does not seek to exalt itself or project itself as more than what we actually are, but has a modest and an honest perspective of its own worth. And humility sits so comfortably alongside love and grace, mercy and compassion in the human spirit. And it's the antithesis or the opposite of pride, with all its fruit of arrogance and selfishness, self-importance, conceit. So it's no surprise, is it, that humility is one of Jesus' outstanding characteristics. We could point to so many instances in his life and in his ministry where he demonstrates this amazing spiritual quality of humility. Particularly, I would reference when he washed his disciples' feet, which was the job of the lowest servant, that as travelers came into the house and with all the dust and the mess of the first century roads, the lowest servant in the house would wash the feet of the guests coming in. And Jesus washed the feet of his disciples at their Last Supper, demonstrating this wonderful quality of humility, servanthood, considering others. But listen to his own words when seeking to lead people out from under this burden of religion and into spiritual freedom and wholeness. He says this, "Come, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." Humility shines through Jesus' words, through his attitudes, through his actions, and humility lay at the heart of his strength and his personality. It's a wonderful quality. Now, throughout history, God's people, especially those who've been called and chosen by God to serve his people, they demonstrate this quality of humility. And one of the greatest ever leaders of God's people was a man called Moses. And here is what was written about him. Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. Goes on to say this, that the Lord chose to speak with Moses face to face. And I want to say, if we want to get to know God, if you want to speak with God, if you want to have that opportunity to connect with God, humility should be our posture. And whenever God's people drifted away from following after the Lord in his ways, the prophets and the leaders of God's people always called them back to humility as the beginning of restoring a right relationship with him. And for every one of us, whether you've been part of Acts Church from the beginning, whether you've recently joined, or whether you're just looking in online and even thinking about joining, for every one of us, humility is the first step towards God. It is the beginning of faith in the human heart. Now here's one of the promises that God made to his people in the Old Testament days, and it's just as relevant for us today. He said this: "If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land." Wow, if ever there was a promise of God that our world needs to hear today, it's this one. Our land, our world needs healing, needs forgiveness. We need God to hear from heaven. The key, he says, is to humble ourselves, to pray and to seek him and turn from our wicked ways. Some 800 years before Jesus came into our world, the prophet Isaiah called out to his people in his day with these words: "Is this the kind of fast I have chosen, says God, only one day for a man to humble himself?" Of course, Isaiah was meaning this is not a special day attitude. This is not a high day and holy day attitude, but this is a chosen lifestyle posture before God and towards people. Humility. One of the other Old Testament prophets, called Micah, captures the very essence of having a right attitude before God when he cries out these words to people who had lost their focus and lost their devotion to God, had drifted away. And he says this, and it's like as if he's speaking to us: "And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." So I just want to think with you for a few moments about how we might cultivate and develop humility in our hearts and our lives as we seek to grow as disciples and followers of Jesus. Now, the leaders of the early church, the apostles, they modeled and encouraged people to live a life characterized by humility. The apostle James, he draws from the Old Testament book of Proverbs and reminds these early believers of this: God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. That's where the title of this talk comes from. And while the apostle Peter draws on exactly the same verses in the book of Proverbs, he challenges his readers and us with these words: "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." So let's come back to Jesus as we come into land here and consider his example and his teaching on humility as we come to the heart of this message. This is what he said to his disciples, and it's as though he's saying it directly to us. You are not to be called rabbi, teacher, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters. And do not call anyone on earth Father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called teachers, for you have one teacher, and that is Christ. The greatest among you will be your servant. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus chose the pathway of obedience and sacrifice as the ultimate expression of his humility. And it's the Apostle Paul who paints this wonderful prophetic canvas for us as he describes the humility and the attitude of Christ. He sums it up in one of the letters he wrote to one of the early churches, and here's just the extract from there. Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage and held on to. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every other name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. You know, Jesus is our ultimate example. And the challenge to each of us today is to intentionally humble ourselves before God and to receive his grace and his mercy into our lives. The proud and the arrogant person argues and contends about the injustices that have been done to them. It's not fair. The humble person chooses to confess their faults to God and accepts his forgiveness with joy and thankfulness. God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. My message is so simple today. It is this, that if you want the grace of God upon your life, choose to humble yourself before him. Put away pride, put away the excuses, put away the reasons that we love to create. Let us humble ourselves before God and accept his forgiveness with joy and thankfulness, accept his mercy and his grace. May God bless you as you consider these things. Thank you for taking the time to listen today.